Hey there, hobby warriors. So in today's video, we're going to be painting some more orcs for my Orruk Warclans army. However, I did want to show, with some sculpts, honestly with any miniatures company, but especially with Games Workshop, you might not be happy with the way it looks. And 3D printing gives us the ability to, create custom models and let your imagination run wild. And that's exactly what I did for this video. So I wanted a Maniak Weirdnob for my Orruk Warclans. If you're playing Big Wa, you get extra Wa points if you use a Bone Splitters mage in your armies, so I needed one. But this sculpt is really old. It's not the greatest looking. And it's also GW exclusive. So, one, I don't have time to wait for this to come in the mail. And I really don't want to pay $27 for something that doesn't look that great. So, turning to one of my trusty favorites, Artisan Guild, they have this Black Razor Hobgoblin pack that they had released over the summer. And one of the neat things with Artisan Guild, all of their sets have modular hand components. So what I'm able to do is take these Razor Beast riders, which are sort of like Cruel Boys riding on hogs, and then I can swap their hands out for this mage Bogtraz Murky Tongue. So he's got the wizard staff with the spell effect coming out of the skulls, and then he's also got this spell effect coming out of his right hand. And I think that will look absolutely awesome as a proxy. So doing this is actually really, really simple. One of the nice things with Artisan Guild is all of the models come pre-supported, so you actually don't have to do much work. It's really just selecting the rider and the Razor Beast and adding them to my scene, and then also going over to Bogtraz Murky Tongue's folder and getting his spell hand and his staff, adding those to the scene. And now I use Chichibox primarily for my slicer. So you just go ahead and get these all situated on your build plate so that they all fit. And that almost looks good. Yep, everybody's on there. Then you just slice this, and then once it's done, export it to your 3D printer, print it, and then you're ready to paint. So I've actually already printed this. So let's go down to the paint table, and I'll show you how I got the model done. If you're interested in learning more about the 3D printing, like what kind of resin I use, what kind of settings, what printer I'm using, and all of those details, let me know down in the comments. But for right now, let's go ahead and hit that paint table and get this mini finished. Hey there, hobby warriors. So we're down at the paint table, and I just want to show off the primed miniature. So I kept this in two parts. So here we have the boar that my custom Maniak Weirdnob is going to be riding. And again, this miniature, both the boar and the gobbo itself, are from Artisan Guild. I went ahead and 3D printed these as a custom mini just because I really hate the current one that Games Workshop has. It's a really old sculpt and it did not age well. But here is the rider, and the kit from Artisan Guild, it's modular. So I went ahead and gave him this staff that has some skulls and some smoky spell effects, and then this other spell hand that has the magic coming out of his fingertips. And then I went ahead and mounted this on a separate base just to make it easier to paint the rider and the boar. And then once everything's all painted, I'll go ahead and pluck him off of this base, stick him on the boar. As usual, I primed with Vallejo Surface Primer, in this case the gray. In a lot of my videos, I'll mix the gray with white acrylic ink, but this time I just stuck with the normal gray. So we're primarily going to use contrast paint for this mini, and we're going to go ahead and get started with Gorgruntifer on the boar. Alright, so with this Gorgruntifer, we're really just going to cover all of the furry areas of the boar, which is the majority of the mini. And it has really good texture on it, so you can kind of just give this one or two nice, relatively thin coats, and it will do what contrast is designed to do, and go ahead and darken down those recesses for us, and give us some shading, and also give us some nice highlights on the top of the texture. And now you want to try to be as neat with this as possible. It's going to be the darkest contrast paint that we're going to use on this mini, so you really don't want to stain the other areas if you can avoid it. That'll just minimize the amounts of cleanup that you'll have to do before we move on to the other stages. There are some areas though where you don't really need to worry, like the hooves. I'm going to paint black, so if we end up getting a little bit of spillover on the hooves, that doesn't really matter. But like the saddle is eventually going to be snakebite leather, so you really want to be neat around there. For that cloth, I'm probably going to do that in red, and that's probably just going to be a standard acrylic paint, not a contrast paint, just because it's so flat. So, you know, if you get a little bit of spillover on areas like that, that's okay. But really just want to be as neat as possible. Avoid that cleanup. Save ourselves some time. This overall should be a relatively quick paint job. Even though there's lots of detail and lots of texture, contrast paint's going to really do the majority of the work for us, and we don't have that many different surfaces on both of the minis, both the boar and the rider. So I'm going to go ahead and finish applying this fur, and then we'll be back in a little bit for the next step. Alright, so we finished applying the Gorgruntifer, and as you can see, one little tip that I've got when you're painting miniatures and you've got, you know, this undercarriage that can't even really see on camera when I turn the mini upside down, don't worry about painting areas that no one's ever going to see. So you can hold the mini, you know, from the side at a perfect 90-degree angle, see what you can see, hit your, you know, those areas with your brush, but do not stress yourself out about trying to hit the underbelly of a model that you just, no one's ever going to see that part. So, moving on, we're going to hit all of the fleshy areas of the boar with Gillam and Flesh. And there's not really that much. It's really just the face area and then the tail. And now with this, it's lighter than the Gorgontifer. So if you spill over onto the Gorgontifer, that's okay. And it'll actually kind of make a blend around those areas if the Gorgontifer is still wet, which can give you a really cool effect. But just getting that nice light brown on all of the fleshy bits. You want to try and avoid getting this on the teeth and the tusks, because we're going to hit those with a different color. And it's going to be a little bit lighter than the Gillam and flesh. So if you mess up, you will need to neaten up the tusk. So try to avoid that where possible. Just want to apply this thinly. Make sure you get it into all of the recesses. That looks pretty good on the face. Let's just get that tail. And that is that for that color. I'm going to give this a couple minutes to dry, and then we'll move on to the next step. Alright, so next up we're going to move on to snakebite leather, and we're going to go ahead and get the saddle in this little pouch. And also the strap that's holding on the armor. Yeah, so the really nice thing with this mini is there's really good texture, but not that many different surfaces, so we're practically done, and this is only our third paint. And now, with this, since this is really our first flat area of the mini, you do want to try to control your pulling. Again, if we get a little bit on the tabard, that's okay. So here I've just cleaned off my brush. You can push this around while it's still wet, try and get it into all of the recesses. And again, I'm not too worried about the finish there, because the rider is going to be covering most of that. But that's really all we need for that. And we can move on to our next step. Alright, so next up, we're going to go ahead and get the tongue in the inside of the mouth, and for that we're going to use this Volupus pink. And we don't need that much of this. It's really just going to go right up. Sorry about that. There, just like that. That's all we need. Right, and now we're moving on to the very last contrast paint that we're going to use on the boar. It's going to be Skeleton Horde, and we're just going to get those tusks and the teeth. Now the trick here is to not overload your brush. And usually when I'm doing Skeleton Horde, I like to do 2 coats. Just because it's so light, normally 1 coat isn't quite enough. You want this really heavy in the recesses. And there we go. That looks pretty good to me. And now we're done with all of the contrast paints. We're going to open up the wet palette, and then we're going to take care of this metal armor and the tabard, and then finally the hooves, and that'll be the board done. Alright, so the base layer for the tabard, I'm going to go ahead and use corn red. It's a very deeply saturated, kind of dark red. Makes a great base layer. Occasionally I will use this. A lot of the time I will use Fiston red, but I tend to find that corn red has slightly better coverage. So sometimes it's best to use that corn red as an initial layer, and then you can go ahead and build up from it. Alright, got the mini centered. And now we don't want to screw up our previous contrast, so you need to be very neat with this. But just go ahead and get a nice even coat on all of this tabard. This has almost got a slightly purple hint to it. And as always, 2 thin coats. We'll let that first coat dry a little bit. Then come to the other side and get this side. And again, if you feel like you don't have good control using a larger brush, like this is a size 4, you know, use the larger brush on the majority of the surface, and then you can switch to a smaller brush, which you'll see me do here in a second, to get those hard to reach areas. Let's go ahead and get our regiment brush. And that way you have maximum control. Right. So I'm not going to make you guys wait for this to dry and then watch me do a second coat. So I'll go ahead and take care of that, and then we'll move on to our second layer. Alright, for our second layer on the red, we're going to use Evil Sun Scarlet. And all we're going to do with this is sort of treat this as a broad highlight. So we're going to avoid the recesses of the red areas and just paint this broadly on all of the flat areas. And again, we're going to use 2 coats of this most likely. We want really strong coverage. And just avoid those recesses. As you can see, I'm kind of glazing this on. The paint's very, very thin. And that just gives us maximum control. And don't be afraid to turn the mini so that it's in a position that's comfortable for you, so that you don't sacrifice your brush control. However, because this is so thin, you may need to load your brush multiple times. When you get to these stitches, you want to make sure you hit those. Right, I'm going to let this first layer dry, and then I'm going to do a second layer, and then we'll move on our final highlight for the red. Right, now our final highlight for those red areas is going to be Wild Rider Red. Now, I'm not going to highlight too much of this, just because a lot of that tabard is going to be covered by our rider's legs. So I'm really only going to focus on the areas that someone would be able to see. So I'm going to get these raised edges over here. And I'm going to paint a thin line on the bottoms of the tabard, like this. And then pick out the tops of the stitches. And that's it. Do the same thing on the other side. And again, don't be afraid to flip your mini around to make it easier for you to maintain control of your brush. Again, just picking out those bottom edges, and then the tops of those stitches. And that's that on the red. Now we'll just go ahead and do the armor. Alright, so for the armor, we're going to go with Lead Belcher. And we're switching back to the big brush so we can coat this as quickly as possible. Now you do want to be careful around the hair. You definitely, again, don't want to mess up the contrast work that we already did. And sometimes I find it helpful to very carefully do all of your edges first. And then that lets you be a little bit messy and paint within the lines that you've just created to coat these areas kind of quickly. So there's not much to this. I'm just going to go ahead and coat this. There's not that much of it on the mini. So I will be back in a second and I'll show you how we're going to finish this armor off. Right, and to finish off the armor on the boar, we're just going to use Basilicum Gray. And we're going to use this like a wash. And just wash this all over the armor plates. This is a very good way to finish off your metallics. And actually, so this will end up looking like a worn iron. Hot tip, if you want a contrast paint gold, use Nudge Drag Yellow over your metallic. And that'll give you a really cool gold effect without having to go through multiple layers and highlights. Just lay down your silver and then go over it once with the Nudge Drag, and that looks pretty awesome. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I might do that on the gobbo here in a little bit. Just so you guys can see what it looks like. So yep, we're just gonna go ahead and give this nice all over coat, work it into the recesses. It's a little bit more pigmented than, say, Nuln Oil, but it also flows a little bit better. And because you get that contraction that happens when the contrast layer dries, you end up getting some highlights out of it without having to come in and do extra work if you don't want to. So just move this around. Be careful when you get around your previous browns that you've already done. And then if you need to, like I do, you could wash off your brush, get the excess wetness off on your arm or something, and then soak up a little bit of this excess. Or excess, rather. I have a really bad habit of saying access when I want to say excess. And there we go. So that's the boar completely done. We'll go ahead and set that off to the side, and then we'll get started on ye old gobbo. Alright, so before we actually start painting the gobbo, I do want to talk through my plan of attack. So it's always very helpful, especially for me with the way my brain is wired, to think about how you're going to approach doing something before you actually start doing something. So this mini, our main areas that we have to worry about, we've got leather strapping, on the armor. He's got leather wraps on his arms. We've got a bunch of armor, which could potentially be all metallic, which is what I'm going to go with. We've got skin, we've got the wood of the staff, we got the skulls, and then we have the spell effect. So my plan of attack here is going to be do all of the leather first, then go ahead and do all of the skin. So any mistakes that we make with the snakebite leather, painting the skin next will let us clean that up. Then we'll go ahead, do all of the metallics in, what's this stuff called? Lead Belcher. Then, while that's drying, we'll move on to the staff and the skulls. Those will be wildwood and skeleton bone, respectively. Then we'll do the spell effects, which will probably be Tesseract Glow. And then we'll come back to the metals, and then some of them will get a coat of Nazdrag Yellow, so it'll be gold. And then other bits will get a coat of Basilicanum Gray, like we did on the boar, so that those will be silver. And painting it in that way, we're sort of working from the innermost part of the miniature, moving to the outer layers. So we can correct our mistakes as we go by painting the next step, and that saves us a lot of cleanup work. And then we're also heavily relying on contrast to do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So, like I said, we're going to get started with snakebite leather and do those leather bits. So let me find that, and I'll be right back. Alright, so here we go. Found my snakebite leather. And now, because of us having this plan of attack, we know that we can be a little messy with this layer, which means we can paint quickly because we don't have to be too careful. So we're just going to go ahead and get these all nice and covered. Now, snakebite leather is one of the better contrast paints, in my opinion. You normally can get nice coverage in one coat, but don't apply it too thickly. Just go ahead, lay down a layer, and if it's not dark enough for you, let it dry and then come back in and do another layer. Then we got these straps on the legs. And don't forget the backside. Then we've also got this little loincloth. So don't forget that. So I'm going to crack on and finish up the few remaining leather bits, and then we'll move on to the skin. So, well-laid plans and all of that. So I realized that we kind of need to let that leather dry before we move on to the skin, because we are going to be butting up right next to it. So while that's drying, we're going to go ahead and apply wildwood on the staff, since that is relatively out of the way from everything else. So don't be afraid when you're painting your own miniatures to, while something's drying, just move on to something else that you can be getting done. So just going to go ahead and coat the staff. Wildwood is one of the heavier pigmented contrast paints that stains really easily. However, that tends to look really good on wood surfaces. So normally I can do my wildwood in one shot, just keep it thin. And now you will get some random blotchiness, but wood naturally has random sort of surface, just to the nature of what it is. So that actually looks okay to me. So I'll normally do just one coat of wildwood, let it dry. Again, don't be afraid to turn your mini however you need to so that you can maintain good brush control. And then we want to try and be neat around these spell effects because we do need those to remain white. But if we make a mistake, we can neaten up with a white layer paint. But just want to try and be as neat as possible around there. Using a smaller brush in these areas can be helpful. Almost done here. If your wildwood starts appearing very light, that typically means you're running out of paint on your brush. We got a couple of really critical areas here where starting to run into the skeletons, and we're running into the spell effect. Just got to be very neat and very careful. Almost there. Alright, there we go. We'll go ahead and get started on the skin now. Alright, so for the first layer of the skin, we're going to go ahead and use Orc Flesh Contrast. Now, I did a video about this very recently. I'll go ahead and put a link up in the cards. But this is a rather problematic contrast paint where it has a very hard time just going on evenly on flat surfaces. Now, this is just going to be my base layer, so I'm not overly concerned. We know how to fix the blemishes from my previous video. But we're just going to go ahead and get this over all of the skin. If you get some inside the mouth or whatever, that's fine. We can tidy that up at a later stage. And again, if we spill over on the armor, that's okay, because we're just going to cover that with a metallic. So you can be a little bit messy with this for the majority of the mini, but you do want to be careful when you start getting close to the browns. You do not want this to spill over onto those areas. So just go around, get an all-over coat on all of the skin. Make sure you do what I'm doing and hit the ears. Get the insides of them too. Alright, I'm going to crack on, get this applied all over, let it dry, and then we'll highlight the skin. Alright, so some areas of the skin are still drying, so we're going to go ahead and hit those couple of skulls with some skeleton horde. And I don't think I ever actually said anything on my channel, but I buy these, God, I forget the name of the mineral. I want to say it's hematite. That might be wrong. But essentially they're little beads that you can buy from any craft or hobby store. The most important thing is that you don't get something that will rust. The ones that I use is really just like a mineral, like a rock. So you don't have to worry about it rusting and introducing iron flakes into your paint. But especially with contrast paint, but really any paint bottle, putting one of those beads in your paint bottle will really help you mix up your paints really well whenever you're shaking. But all we're going to do is get this applied on these couple of skulls here. And just like the bone bits on the boar, you know, you might need 2 coats because this is a very thin contrast paint. And I like my skulls to be a little dark, especially if they've been carried by an orc who's, you know, doing God knows what, lives in a super dirty environment. Again, you want to be very careful around these spell effects. I've already accidentally got some orc flesh on the spell effect, and I don't quite know how that happened, because it was nowhere near a piece of skin, but I'm going to have to do a little bit of cleanup, but it's always best if you can try and avoid that. And there we go, those skulls look pretty good. So while those are drying, we'll go ahead and address the skin. Alright, so just like in my previous video, as you can see, the orc flesh, it gives you really nice shading, but again, on those flat areas of the skin, it just, you know, does not dry smoothly at all. So I'm not going to spend as much effort on this gobbo as I did on the orcs in the previous video, but I am going to do a couple thin layers of oh, what's this stuff called? Orc flesh, to try and smooth out some of these blemishes on the the flat areas of the skin, and I'm really only focused on the areas that are going to be visible, and I'm treating this as my highlight. So skin's really just going to get one highlight. I'm not worried about any blemishes that are going to be down facing or on the inside of the legs, for instance, because that's all going to be hidden once it's sitting on the boar. And now this paint is super thin, so it definitely is going to take a couple of coats to build up to a nice color. And I'm not using an intermediary color like I did in my previous video. So it's gonna have to be a little bit more patient with this than I normally would. Getting the knuckles on the hand is a really great spot to highlight. And with this first layer, it's going to be barely noticeable because that Orruk flesh is so dark compared to the Orruk flesh. Yep. I'm going to go ahead and finish doing this first layer, and then we'll come back for a second layer. Alright, so here's the skin after about 4 layers of Orruk flesh to flatten, or not flatten, sorry, to smooth out the areas that are going to be highlights as well as that had blemishes from using the contrast paint. And now, as you can tell, like here on this calf, like that is a very stark transition line. And so what I've done, I went ahead and mixed up a glaze here on my wet palette. It is 1 part Orruk flesh, our original tone, to 4 parts transpirator, which is just acrylic medium with no pigment in it. You can use glaze medium from Liquitex, or if you've got Lamian medium from Citadel, or even just plain old like matte satin, gloss medium, whatever you've got around, just something that doesn't have pigment in it to thin this out. Now we're going to do a load test on my thumbnail. And yeah, that's really nice and thin. And so now we're probably going to need quite a few layers to get this all blended. But we just want to go ahead and glaze this over all of those transition points. And with every layer that we do, it'll smooth out those transition lines and blend our Orruk flesh down to our Orc flesh. I'm trying to enunciate that as well as possible so that you guys can differentiate what I'm actually talking about. But you're just going to give this an all-over glaze on all of the skin for the first couple of layers. And you don't want to mess with this while it's drying. This is super thin paint. If you try to apply a secondary layer too early, you'll rip off the previous layer. Again, it's one of the downsides of doing these sorts of things with acrylics. The drying time is just so, or the working time rather, is so short that You have to work really, really quickly, and then you can't disturb it while it's drying. So I'll go ahead and finish this first layer, and then I'll come back after a couple layers and show you what it looks like when it's all blended. Alright, so here we are after about 4 coats worth of glaze, and I actually forgot the inside of that ankle. But here we are after about 4 coats of glaze, and as you can see, those areas that were super stark are really, really softened now. The worst offender being this calf, but everything else is fairly blended. So I'm going to go ahead and keep working on that calf, and then we'll go ahead and make a start on the armor, and go ahead and get our gobbo done. Right, so for the armor, we're going to go ahead and base everything in lead belcher. Now we do need to be very, very careful. This is literally the second to last step. Everything else has color on it. So we need to be very, very neat around the areas of skin. So I'm starting with a smaller brush just so that I've got that fine control. But we're going to go ahead and base coat all of these areas in lead belcher, and then we'll go ahead and tint them with a couple of contrast paints. So I'm going to go ahead and crack on and get this all coated, and then I'll show you how we're going to shade them. Alright, so we've got the lead belcher base coat down on all of the armor, and now I'm going to do his cod piece as gold. So we're going to give it a coat of this Nazdrag yellow. And since we're applying this over the metallic paint, and the contrast paint is translucent, it'll end up tinting it gold, while also giving us our recess shading at the same time, which is a really cool effect. So just give this one coat right over that lead belcher. Just like that. And then if you got too much of it, just dry your brush off a little bit, and that'll let you get some of that excess off. Keep doing it. There you go. And now for the rest of the metallic areas, we're going to do those in a silver. So just like we did on the boar, we're going to just use... Nope, not that. I've got too many paint zones. Basilicon gray. So. And just like we applied the Nazdrag yellow, just on the rest of the metallics, go ahead and give them this coat. And what I like to do with this, especially if I'm using a smaller brush, is I'll run a line of that Basilicanum gray in the recess wherever an armor piece meets some other texture on the model, and that'll kind of give you a lining effect. Contrast paint is perfect for doing that sort of thing because of the capillary action it wants to run into those recesses. So you can be very accurate with it. But this is it. This is my favorite way of speed painting metallics. Do it in 2 coats, and you get your shade, your base layer, and your highlight all done at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up the rest of the metallics. And then all we have to do is the spell effect and the final assembly. Alright, so next up we're going to use Tesseract Glow on the spell effect on the staff and coming out of the right hand. Now this is a very thick paint, and it separates very, very quickly. So one, you need to make sure it's mixed up well. So I actually shook this for a solid like 2 minutes off camera, and it had already started separating. So, gotta work fast, and all we're gonna do is give this a really nice all-over coat on all of these spell effect areas. And so what this is sort of like a green and yellow paint that like don't mix together. So as it dries, the green and the yellow will separate, and the green tends to run toward your recesses, and the yellow will stay in your highlight area. But the effect only works if the paint is well mixed before you apply it, and then you have to apply it like all in one shot. You can't let like some of it dry and then try to come back in. You'll get tide marks. So working quickly with this is very, very important. And my blue tack that I used to adhere this to the base is starting to come loose, so I'm hoping it can just hold on and let me get through this. This is the last step before we connect the mini to the bore. And you gotta rotate your mini and make sure you're getting all the different angles on the inside. Because all of that will be visible. There, that's all of that side. And now you just let that dry, you don't touch it. Now it'll be fine as is. For a little bit of extra definition, you can dry brush it with a white, and that will give you a really cool effect and kind of adds in that second highlight. But like I said, it'll be perfectly fine as is. I'm not going to dry brush it tonight. Mostly because I'm just trying to do this as quickly as possible, because I've still got a lot of crap that I need to get painted in the next couple of weeks before the big Thanksgiving Day showdown that I've been talking about. And I'm going to do another video this weekend kind of detailing what we're doing with that game. It's going to be a custom narrative scenario that I made up, where because we have a 3-way game and everybody's bringing 2,000 point armies, and so we needed to do something where the game will still be fun for everyone, but we didn't want the objective to solely be be the last person standing. Because in a game like that, if two players gang up on you and it's 4,000 points, versus your 2,000 points, that's not a very fun game, and you're probably going to lose. So I've created a scenario that sort of solves that problem, where the win condition isn't based on you killing your opponent. So you can tactically, decide to attack your opponent if you feel like it'll help you complete the mission objectives, but the mission objective themselves does not require you to kill any of the other players. So I'll do a video on that and kind of talk through what we're doing. I think it's super cool, and I hope when we dive into it that some other people might find it useful and want to give it a go. Alright, so those spell effect areas are done. Now all we have to do is let that completely dry, and then we'll go ahead and mount it on the boar. Alright, so the Gobbo's not completely dry. I'm just impatient. It's dry enough. So what we're going to do now is very carefully remove it from the base and get this blue tack off. So the blue tack's already a little loose on the base. What I'm actually going to do here is use this sculpting tool to try and separate it from this foot as I pull, and then separate it from the other one as I keep pulling. And then very carefully try to remove the rest of it. The issue here being that there's going to be a point where it's connected to paint, and you don't want that to lift off. If there's still a little bit attached to the feet, that's okay. We're going to paint over this. Just kind of use the sculpting tool to try to make it as flat as possible. And then we want to test fit where this is going to go on the board. So it sits perfectly right there. So now what we're going to do is I've got some super glue. This is a high viscosity, very thick glue, but we don't want this like super glooped up. So what I'm going to do is put a little bit of this on a toothpick. And now a lot of people use like hobby super glue. The label's kind of busted for me, rubbing on it. But this is like super heavy duty DAP brand glue that like it takes a little while to set, but once it's set, I have not found a super glue that gives a better bond than this stuff. So now that we've kind of got an idea of where that's going to sit, just want to spread this glue in that crotch region so that you've got a nice even layer, give you the best contact point that you can get. And then you're just going to carefully set it back down. And you have to very, very quickly find that place where it's going to sit, and then just hold it for a few seconds. And yeah, that's enough contact for that glue to finish setting and drying. Now, while that is sitting there, we're going to pull back out our Orruk flesh. Orc flesh, the contrast paint. And we're just going to clean up the feet in the visible areas where we weren't able to paint them because of the blue tack being in the way. Oh, just get a little bit on the brush. And even though there was a little bit of blue tack remaining on the feet on the bottom, we can paint over that. Leaving that on there isn't that big of a deal. It's on the bottom of the mini, so nobody's going to see any texture that it may have left behind. You just don't want any white primer showing. So we've got that cleaned up. Oh, a little bit on that toe there. There. We've got that cleaned up, so I'm going to let that glue set, do my basing, and we'll move into the outro. Alright, Hobby Warriors, so here is the finished model, and I hope you all agree. I feel it looks way better than the original Maniak Weirdnob from Games Workshop, and I hope that you all see that with the power of 3D printing, your imagination is just the beginning. There's so many talented artists out there that are making so many customizable miniatures that you can truly make something absolutely unique and make it your own. And have a really cool, centerpiece or a really cool unit in your army to fill those gaps where sometimes the official models just don't look all that great. As usual, if you're interested in how I did my basing for this miniature, I'll go ahead and put a link up in the cards to my basing guide that goes over how to use the Geek Gaming Scenics range like I did on this miniature and pretty much all of the miniatures for this army. And that's it for today, guys. Make sure you like, share, follow us on Instagram for all those work in progress pics, and I'll see you in the next video. Keep slaying the gray, Hobby Warriors.